welcome to our community discussion forum today. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful wintry morning. We'd appreciate it if you move forward, if you just came in, and that way people who come in even later, it makes them just a little bit easier for them to come in. My name is Laura Christian-Imbernoni, and I'm the coordinator for today's discussion on Brexit, financial, U.S. and international impact. And as you see, if you opened your paper this morning, it's a very timely topic for us to explore today. We have a mission in this congregation: to search and to serve. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the continuing search for truth and the importance of serving others. We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individuals and collective growth for all who attend. Almost all our forums are recorded on YouTube. If you want to see them, go to the YouTube channel and search for UU Congregation of Cleveland. So today's topic of discussion on Brexit has been held prominent in the news for several years, and especially in the last week. How does Great Britain leaving the European Union, with or without an agreement, affect Great Britain and Ireland, or Europe, or the United States, or the world economy? Why is Great Britain separating from the European Union? Is the very existence of the EU threatened if a domino effect occurs? If Britain's tariff-free status with other European members is eliminated, how will trade with the EU countries and the US be affected? Are nationalist elements in the UK responsible for its exit from the EU? All of these things are very interesting for us to explore today, and as it happens, we have a speaker who has been studying the European Union for decades. Elliot Posner is a professor of Case Western Department of Political Science. He teaches courses on international relations, the international political economy, the European Union, Sub-Saharan Africa, and international non-governmental organizations. Earning a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana, where he taught English and math to 8th and 9th graders. We really welcome you here today.
Let me turn on the mic. I was supposed to do that. It should be green.
Yes.
There we go. How is that?
Good.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I'm honored to be part of your forum. I'm currently teaching my undergraduate course at Case on the European Union, and just this week we were talking about Brexit, but I've been following Brexit intensely for several years now, 4, 5, and I can tell you I just can't get, I can't talk about it enough. I'm obsessed with it. So thanks for giving me this chance. It is timely. That obviously wasn't planned when I was invited, but here we are. In case you didn't read the story this morning, Brexit is sort of happening. It's happening on Friday, the 31st. So as of, let's see, Saturday, the 1st of February, the UK won't be part of the European Union anymore. So we'll talk about what that means. I'll discuss, there's an interim period where nothing really will change. Well, something will change. And I'll talk about that too. Let me just, so I have about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. Let me tell you what I plan to do. Because I've been teaching undergraduates in the United States for many, many years, I know that many people in the United States know nothing about the European Union. We are not taught in schools. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer with some slides. We'll go through it quickly just so that everybody's on board. And then I'll talk about, there's a host of questions that are out there. Why did it take so long? 4 years since the referendum in 2016. Why did it take so long for the UK to leave? What are some of the deeper reasons behind Brexit? And then I'll briefly talk about some scenarios for the future, because as the title, I really struggled with the title today, but there still really isn't a future. We don't know the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. So we don't really know yet how Brexit's going to affect the United States or international companies or people in Britain or Europe. So let me just get started here. When I teach, one course I teach at Case is a doctoral program in the Weatherhead Business School. And there I get professionals in the classroom who have had long already, they're already mid-career or they're at the end of their career. And I always ask them, well, what do you know about the EU? And usually throughout their whole life, they're my age or older, and they're saying, well, I never even really thought about the EU until I got involved in either data privacy or a competition. I'm a lawyer and my company got embroiled in EU. My point is that it's sort of been this stealth, it's been a stealth polity that's developed in the course of our lives, and suddenly it emerges and you find out that, wow, there's 500 million people who are part of a single market over there, and for my company to operate there, it has to be compliant with these piles and piles of rules that have stacked up. And so that's how most Americans my age learn anything about the EU. I just wanted you to see this slide because it starts very modestly with 6 countries that decided to cooperate in the area of coal and steel, and then in '58 you get the what was then called, this is part of the problem, is that the name has changed over time so many times. It was called the European Economic Community originally, and then they dropped, then it became the EC, European Communities, and now, it takes on its name as European Union when about the same time they decided to give up their currencies. Well, some of the countries gave up their currencies. I just wanted to remind you, so basically the way I explain it to my undergrads is that there's 2 types of big events that have happened in the development of the European Union. There's been deepening, where the countries decide to cooperate more intensively, for example, when they decided that they would go forward with the euro. And then there's enlargements, that's what they call them, when they add additional member states to the project. So it started out with 6 countries, Germany, France, Germany, France, Italy, and then the Benelux countries. And then you can see here, the UK doesn't even join until 1973, which is really important because they weren't there at the ground floor. Now, they had decided they didn't want to join the original grouping, but they tried, soon afterwards, they did change their mind, and they tried to join. And de Gaulle vetoed it twice. So that's why it wasn't until, so here you go. It's not a state. It's not a sovereign state. By state, I'm a professor of international relations, so when I say state, I don't mean California, Ohio. I mean a sovereign country. So it looks like a state, which is part of why it's a little confusing. It's not a state. It's not a sovereign state, but it has these institutions that make it seem like it's state-like. So there's this one, the European Council, which is the heads of state that all sit around and they make the agenda. This one and this one, the European Parliament, which has directly elected members, they act like a legislature. It's a two-body legislature. This European Commission, this is where those Brussels bureaucrats are. These are the bureaucrats. It's in Brussels. So when people talk about the paper pushers and the bureaucracy that you heard in the campaign with Brexit, that they want to regain their sovereignty, they're talking often about these bureaucrats in Brussels that are making rules in an undemocratic way. That's what the campaign said. They have a court. There's a court. It's actually changed its name now. Problem. I still call it the European Court of Justice, but it's the European. It's the European. Oh dear. It's the Court of Justice of the European Union now. There we go. And it acts like a constitutional court. And it's done more than that. Over time, if you're a legal scholar, you would say that through legal decisions, they've created rights for citizens and companies that weren't there in the original treaty, because it's a treaty-based organization. And in fact, the court, legal scholars would say that they've created a constitution for the European Union. There's the European Central Bank, which for the 19 countries that gave up their currencies, so that's another thing. Not all countries in the European, this is part of the confusion, not all countries in the European Union participate in all of the cooperation projects. So you only have 19 members that gave up their currency and gave up their monetary policy and gave it over here to the European Central Bank. And of course, the UK was one of those countries that didn't give up its currency, along with Sweden and Denmark and others. This is their foreign service, which was created in the last treaty, which is 2007, Treaty of Lisbon. And then there's a whole world of these agencies. For example, there's an agency that decides, they've decided to cooperate intensively in the area of the regulation of chemicals, for example, or data privacy. They believe in regulation of private data much more than in the United States. So they have this agency at the European Union level. All the countries have a representative there. It has its own bureaucracy, and they come up, it's like the SEC or another type of agency. They come up, there's agreed legislation at the political level, and then they have sort of technical agencies that come out with technical decisions. So in the case of chemicals, one of the things they do is they decide which chemicals are okay. They do the precautionary principle with chemicals like we do with medicines, that companies can't put chemicals in their products unless they have been approved and don't do harm beforehand. It's the opposite here in the United States. But I'm just giving you an illustration of how these agencies work. There's a ton of these. They cover all these areas of the economy. So that's what the chemical agency decides, which of these, what's on the list of chemicals that are okay to put in products. And of course, there's lots of leaders. There's the heads of state that we know. Johnson's in red because he's out as of Friday. There's a president of the European Council. There's a president of the European Commission. This is the Secretary of State, and Lagarde is the head of the ECB. And so, of course, people like me, who are scholars of the EU, spend a lot of time arguing, well, what is this? What is this political entity? What do we call it? What category? Everybody agrees it's not your regular international organization. A typical international organization, like the United Nations, or the IMF, or the World Trade Organization, it's clear you have members. The sovereign countries are the members, and things need to usually proceed with unanimous voting. the European Union long ago, or even from the start, never quite fit that category. And here's just some of the reasons why. Because they have a whole a whole process for legally binding legislation via supranational, by supranational I mean international, above the nation processes. They have this, a constitution built in legal precedent, as I mentioned. There's these autonomous supranational parts to it. It doesn't fit your regular international organization. You get the idea. Some people call it a federation. So for a while, people were saying it's a future state. It will be the future state of Europe. People don't say that so much anymore. Okay, yeah. There's some then. Right. I threw this in this morning because I felt like, I'm a professor of international relations, and so I asked myself this morning, so what do I think when I think about the European Union? And for me, it was and continues to be this reinvention of, because remember, it comes out of the ashes of World War II, after these two horrendous world wars. And it became a model to the world that these mortal enemies could cooperate over time and reinvent the way that they interact with one another. And so for me, that's how I think of it. It was a model to the world. It was a blueprint for how it's possible to recreate international relations in your part of the world, and how to also contribute to the prosperity of the member countries. So it was a model to the world. And I think that's important. I'm going to come back to this at the end, because the European Union, this set of crazy institutions that's really hard for outsiders to figure out, that's the way they did it. But it doesn't mean, or I should go back and say that's one of the main contributing factors for how we ended up with this new model for how the countries were going to interact with each other in Europe. But so I mean, just if you think about the logic here, we could still maintain, just because the EU, those institutions, is changing, the UK's pulling out, things are changing in other ways in the European Union, just because of that doesn't mean that we should be so pessimistic that the model itself, or that the actual practice, the new reinvention of how the European countries get along, is going to go away too. So that's a little bit my long-winded way of saying this. I'm not entirely pessimistic about where things are going in the European Union. I just wanted to, as you know, the EU's long been a source of contention in Europe and outside of Europe, and so I just thought I would remind you of the Eurosceptics' view, and so you'll hear the complaints about the monster. You heard this from the pro-Brexit camp in the UK, that it's a monster bureaucracy with a democratic deficit that eats international sovereignty. It's a Trojan horse for neoliberalism, and it's an elite-driven project. Whereas the Europhile view is, you heard some of this from me just now, is that it's a major contributor to regional stability after these huge changes in wars and the end of the Cold War. It's been a source of prosperity and liberty, because after all, it's a market-making project. The main thrust, there's a lot more to it, but the main thrust has been creating what they call a single market, so that even though there's many sovereign countries involved, it's as if for the firms and individuals, it's as if they're in one. So the rules are the same. So that, in fact, they talk about the four freedoms of from the very start, in the very first of the treaties of Rome. They talk about the four freedoms, and so here they're talking about the people. The goal was people, capital, goods, and services would be mobile and would be able to cross borders as if they were in one country. That was the goal, and that's what they mean by their single market, and the way they tried to achieve that was through creating common rules, agreed to common regulations, common rules for citizens to work and operate in different countries. Okay, and then again, this idea of it's a model to the world. And they came up, when I say that reinvention, it was very innovative. They came up with all of these very clever ways to improve relations among countries. All right, now I just also wanted to highlight in my, before I start addressing some of the questions, I think it's really important to realize that there's been a whole set of challenges, historical challenges, and I mean, it's really been a remarkable conjuncture of difficult problems that have faced the European Union as a project, cooperation project. You might have heard of democratic backsliding, by which people are referring to what's happening in Poland and Hungary. That is, in order to join the European Union, you had to be a good, democratic, liberal, democratic, market-oriented place. And so we've seen, if you're following what's going on in Hungary and Poland and other countries too, is that countries that, especially in countries that have joined more recently, both those two countries joined in 2004 and were part of the Soviet sphere of influence before and had been communist, so they had turned their governments and markets, economies and societies upside down in order to join the European Union. And so we see some backsliding. This is the illiberal democracies I'm talking about. There's the populism, of course, Russia's resurgence, gobbling up Crimea, meddling in all the elections in Europe, just like here, and of course Ukraine, which is where it's all coming to a head. Donald Trump has become a huge challenge for the Europeans. They never imagined a US president taking some of the positions that he's taken vis-a-vis NATO and the European. He's been a huge critic of the European Union project, supporting Brexit and Johnson. Of course, terrorism, the immigration crisis, where the Syrian war, I mean, the Syrian war, where millions of Syrian asylum seekers entered Europe and found it very easy to do, created a huge crisis. The Eurozone crisis, if you think our financial crisis was horrible, it was worse in Europe. And it also, especially in the countries that had given up their currencies for reasons that, I mean, we can talk about. I'm happy to talk about it, but it's certainly not over. This is where a banking crisis in Europe turns into a sovereign debt crisis for countries like Greece and Portugal. And of course, the separatist movements, Barcelona, the Catalonia, Scotland, and now, of course, Brexit. No, you can't see this here, that no member state had ever left before, and this created a new challenge also. So, some people have said that one of the questions is the EU disintegrating. I just want to point out, as part of my 1, 2, 3 on the European Union, is that there's a lot of evidence in the EU that things are moving forward, intensifying the cooperation going on in the face of all these challenges. So it's not quite right. I don't think anybody should look at those challenges and say that the project is over. It's a more complicated picture than that. And if you follow some of the details here, you'll know that they did some things that weren't even imaginable a few years ago. Like 10 years ago, nobody would have imagined that the European countries would give up their supervisory authority over banks. That had been, for reasons that I won't go into, but the idea that you're going to have an independent European level regulator of your banks, and also the power to bail them out. You know, banks in Europe are even more central to the economy than they are here. I mean, that nobody thought would happen, and yet that's gone forward. That's happened since the crisis. And there's also been some interesting changes in the way that the EU is covered by the media. There's now newspapers that everybody in Brussels will go to the same one, sort of in the same way, because people had complained that there wasn't a single political arena where you could really discuss the European Union. So anyway, there's evidence, and this last one's actually very important. Is in the face of Brexit, the European Union negotiation, in these negotiations, the European Union remained extremely unified. And I'll get back to that. And that was really surprising for some. Okay, so let me. I think I'm going to be going a few minutes over. Is that okay?
You have about 8 minutes. Will that work?
Oh, yes. We'll make it work, right? So I could go on and on. You can tell, but I won't. I won't. There's this. So let's just talk about some of these questions. A little background here. First is, I had these pretty little flags, but they turned into EU versus. Okay, just quickly, again, the UK was a latecomer, so they had always complained they weren't there to design the European Union, and they were never comfortable. It had a French flavor. The actual political institutions, that has always been a problem. The British attitudes, if you have relatives in the UK, they always talk about the Europeans, and they don't include themselves. There's always been this, and the polls have shown it for decades. They've never identified, as in other countries, with the European Union project in the same way. It's been a favorite mode of political I don't know what to call it, whereby politicians in the UK love to blame the EU for everything. It's been a great punching bag, and I should say another big background factor is that the UK's response to the financial crisis had been largely austerity, cutting the budget, and so the people, this is all to say that for the average person, things haven't been great economically. So these are all background conditions to Brexit, and I just want to say also background, just so that you know, is that in the past when the UK had complained, like Margaret Thatcher wanted her money back, you might remember, and there was so Brexit wasn't the first time that the UK had been complaining about the EU, but in the past, the general reaction in the EU was, fine, we'll be flexible. So with the euro, they said, fine, you don't want to join? We'll have two-speed Europe. We'll call it two-speed Europe. Some countries can't, some countries won't. Schengen, this is the border arrangement where there's no border, you go into Belgium and you can cross into France and there's no border control there. UK didn't want to be part of that either. Fine. Social contract, fine, you don't have to do it. So I'm just showing that no matter what there could have been, could there have been a new EU arrangement that was more flexible and allowed the UK to have some of the things that it was complaining about? If you roll back the clock 5 years ago, it's possible to imagine that, but that's not what happened. And I just want to say, one of the legacies of this, however, was that when we got to the financial crisis, the priorities were different, and I think that helps explain the deep differences that were emerging on the continent and versus what was happening in the UK. Whereas the Germans were fully focused on how to save the euro and what needed to be done. That wasn't UK's main problem. They had other things on their mind. Okay, where are things? Just that the UK, so this week, the Parliament approves the withdrawal agreement. That means that it covers 12 months. There's this interim period. So during this 12 months, everything stays the same in terms of crossing borders and products going back and forth and all this sort of stuff, except for now the UK has no voice at the table. The UK's been removed from all the decision-making bodies, but they still have to comply with all the EU rules. And then this is what I want to talk about, the Irish border. So the withdrawal agreement contains this fudged arrangement where Northern Ireland will be treated differently from the rest of the UK. So why, this is my first question, why did it take so long? Well, the main reason is that there was this stalemate over the Irish border. There were other things that had to get worked out, but the main sticking point was this Irish border, and there's too much text here for you to read, so let me just get to the bottom of it, is that the short answer is that Brexit revealed all these things that people really didn't realize. I think that that's it. Very few people discussed the Irish border or the Good Friday Agreement, saw the connection between the EU and the Good Friday Agreement. But it turns out, so a key part of the Good Friday Agreement, the 1998 agreement that brings peace to Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the country of Ireland, and the country of Ireland, of course, is a member of the European Union. Is a soft border, so that soft border meaning that there's no border control for people or goods or anything. But that was only possible. That happens in 1998, and Ireland and the UK are both members of the European Union by this point, long, 2 decades after they joined. So it was in the background. But the reason you can have a soft border between the Irelands is because they had the same rules. They were part of the same market, the single market of the European Union. So the sticky point, a huge sticky point, was how to preserve this soft border in Ireland when the UK is pulling out and saying we're not going to any longer be complying with the single market or the customs union that's all part of the European Union. So that was that's what really made it so hard. That's why Theresa May, she couldn't come up with a formula. And so what happened is, and it didn't work, Johnson had to go and have another election before he could make it work. There were too many divisions on this. And in the end, what happened was Johnson basically said, okay, well, we can't make this work because basically, lies is probably the wrong word, but during the campaign, they just made a lot of promises and they were incompatible with one another. You couldn't have this thing called Global Britain, which is the idea that Great Britain would be able to have its own independent trade agreements with the United States and other countries. Combined with regaining sovereignty by making your own rules instead of having to accept the rules of the European Union, while at the same time keeping that soft border between the Irelands. The only way to do it would be to treat Northern Ireland differently from the rest of Great Britain. And so that's what Johnson did, but he could only do it with a new election, because before the election, he was his party was dependent on a Northern Ireland party. but the election gave him such numbers that he didn't have to worry about it. In the question and answer period, if you want to talk about sovereignty, because that's been one of the big things, the UK is, the pro-Brexit camp has promised that they're going to regain lost sovereignty. And so we'll talk about what that means. I'm happy also to talk about what I've been thinking about, because a lot of my work has been on the politics of financial stuff in Europe and the United States. And so the city here is the City of London. And so the question for us is, if you know anything about the UK, you know that one of their leading industries is finance. The City of London, one of two between, it's either New York, the leading financial hub in the world is either New York or London. And here it does seem that leaving the EU is not in the interests, the material interests of financiers. So why on earth did this happen? You know, how can we explain that the UK went ahead with Brexit even though it undermines one of their main industries? I mean, that's really a very interesting question. And then finally, I'll leave you with some ideas. I have three what's been agreed so far is this year of transition. That's what the withdrawal agreement is about. The future, and that's 1 year. That's 1 year. That year is supposed to be for coming up with a new arrangement for how the UK and the EU will be connected. And so if they can't come up with something at the end of the year, Johnson says he's not going to extend it, and that's the no-deal Brexit that people talk about. So there's just a bunch of different scenarios that people can think of for what this can look like. This is what I mean by there's no future yet, because we don't know what the arrangement's going to be. That's what this next year is going to be about, coming up with what will the future look like. And I won't go through them. I'll just say it's possible things will look largely the same, and people in 10 years won't really care whether UK's in or out, because from the point of view of companies and individuals, it seems pretty much the same. But then there are other scenarios too. And one of them is that the UK could turn into a nightmare for the European countries, low tax place, low regulatory regime, or the flip, that the UK ends up having to comply with to have access to European markets. UK finds itself having to comply with all the EU rules, but really having no say over those rules any longer. So I think those are the three main possible scenarios. Okay, I'll stop there and we can have a discussion.
Thank you. And before we get started with questions and answers, Susan Alcorn's going to pass out a little flipboard here that you can sign up for emails so that you can hear about more community discussions. Now we have 4 rules for question and answer. The first is our microphone holders choose the person asking the question, not the speaker. Keep your question short, no speeches please. Hold the microphone very close to your mouth so everyone can hear, and then we encourage the expression of diverse points of view. We ask everyone to be respectful whether or not you're in agreement with others who are speaking. So obviously he has talked with us about a number of possibilities, and now we're open for questions.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. So this question is kind of a bit of supposing, but there's a lot of that regarding Brexit, I think, probably. So the Irish question aside, if Scotland is unhappy with being part of the UK, which is leaving the EU, and in a future referendum, Scotland decides to leave the UK and become an independent country, then the political base of the Labour Party is cut not in half, but maybe by a third. And the Labour Party ceases to be really a viable competitor for the Conservative Party. The Brexit parties no longer have any reason to exist, and the Liberal Democrats are really not strong enough. Does this mean that in a few years we might see the end of Britain as a two-party democracy and a sort of become a kind of one-party state?
Oh wow. Okay, so you are now deep into UK politics, and I mean, I know this sounds like a cop-out, but I'm an EU expert, and I've had to learn the hard way about UK politics because of the, over the last couple of years. So obviously, so I think one of the things we learned in this last election, where the Tories had a landslide, where Johnson emerges with this huge majority, we can see something that political scientists have known forever, is that when you're in a system with first past the post, so that it's like our own system. So you have a district, and whoever gets more than the majority of the votes gets, they get the representative. So what happened, we saw this, the problem with that when there's multiple parties. So you had the Liberal Democrats were pro-Remain, they're not in favor of Brexit, and Labour was split. And so you would have many districts where the Conservatives, so the stay votes, the Remain votes, were split between these parties, and that's how Johnson ends up with so many representatives. So I guess the short answer, I don't have a good answer to you. I just want to say on Scotland, they're not going to be able to have another referendum soon because with Johnson in power, because to have the referendum, they need the approval, Parliament's approval, and they're not going to do that. So that may be down the road, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, because we've heard a lot about a second independence referendum for Scotland. I don't know about the Labour Party, what's going to happen. It's split, right? And it's much diminished in this last election. So I take your concerns, but I'm not expert enough to say more. Yes.
Thank you.
I just heard an economist talk about our economy, and I asked him what Brexit meant. And he gave a little different view, which was, why would you want to be in an organization with high unemployment, high taxes, high regulation? And versus what I heard, which is London is going to become second class in the financial world. Is there a way to, what's going to happen to the English economy versus without, when Brexit occurs?
Well, one of the strangest things that I hinted at before about this Brexit decision is that the City of London, the financial industry in London, has been a huge beneficiary of European integration, of European cooperation, because many of the big financial firms, the big banks on the continent, set up shop in London. And so that's why, one of the reasons why we never thought this would happen. One of the surprises over the last 4 years is that London, the financial services industry in London, because there had been people who said this is a disaster for London, that the jobs are going to go to the continent, because remember, we're talking about, right now, before Brexit, there was 500 million consumers, and that's a very big market, and they're largely wealthy. And so this is why companies would set up in London and be able to have access to those customers. So people, of course, thought, well, if there's a potential that you'll have to have two operations, one in London and one on the continent, and there's so many more people in the continent that you would need, that companies, banks would choose, financial companies would choose just to set up shop over there and abandon London. But so far that hasn't really happened. there's been some hedging, and I mean, if there's one thing I've learned in my research is that financial companies are extremely agile and they figure these things out. We don't need to worry about them. They are going to figure it out. They just needed certainty. They needed to see what the rules were going to be. But one of the surprises is the City of London has done really quite well in this period. There's been some jobs gone to the continent, and there's reports in the Financial Times that apartments in Paris are going up in value as London financiers, hedge their bets and buy apartments in Paris. But so far, London seems like it's in good shape. Now as I mentioned before, I think the great fear for the Europeans and why they're going to want to play hardball, meaning that they're not going to give London-based firms access to the European Union if they have lax regulations. Their fear is that London will become an offshore financial center, more so than it is. And that is the great fear of the Germans and the French and the Dutch and the Italians, and so they won't allow it. They're going to basically say, I'm sorry, you have to set up shop in the European Union if you want to operate and have access to our rich market. So I think it's more complicated than this person you were listening to. And we don't know. I guess right now, their rules are the same. It would be really easy to come up with a deal that allows easy access across the English Channel. I'm not the one to choose. Is that correct? The speaker doesn't choose? Oh, there we go.
First, thank you for connecting what I never thought would be possible, the two words, European Union and fascinating. That in and of itself was worth coming this morning. Could you focus a little bit on the softer question of cultural identity and the emotional aspect of Brexit, and if that going forward is going to be an issue?
I have a few things I could say about that. First of all, one of the challenges that I pointed out, or one of the criticisms that I pointed out, is that people have criticized the EU for being a project of the elites. And sociologists have shown this to be true. That there's a top tier, maybe 10% of the European Union population that really benefits and feels very close and identifies closely with the European project. These are people who, from any country, they live in London or Amsterdam or Milan, and they benefit greatly from, and they speak many languages, they're highly educated, and they benefit greatly from the project. And then there's a second tier, maybe 25% that are largely pro-Europe. They see the benefits of it. But then there's a large bottom sphere grouping that is either hostile, or they don't think about it, they don't think it benefits them, or they think it hurts them. This has been the source of Euroscepticism. They don't feel European, they feel Italian, or they feel Spanish. And so that's a background condition for why populists have been successful in using the EU as the punching bag and that sort of thing. Now, just to take it back to the UK, I have my students read this crazy article that I think really shows how in the UK feelings, attitudes are quite different. There's this project, the Erasmus project, that's part of the European Union that allows college students to study in other countries, and this is a very popular program. The studies show that whereas participants from all the other countries emerge with a feeling of being more European, they identify more after doing the program, they feel more European. British participants, there's no effect. They don't affect, it doesn't affect them. So, I mean, there's something different. I think that says a lot.
Could the island effect?
It could be the island effect. I don't know. It's not like the British are the only ones with their own history, long history. Or,
They've been isolated, no.
Yeah. Yes.
I've been having real difficulty trying to figure out what Brexit means for us. And for what you put up on the screen, I'm sure you can't give us a definitive answer, but I wonder if you have a most likely scenario.
Right. Well, I think in the big picture, what we should care about in the United States is that the European mode of international relations continues as it has been since World War II. And so, meaning that it's a reliably peaceful place, and where countries are able to cooperate in ways, in economic ways, in other ways. So I think we have a big interest in that in the United States. After all, I think in the end we'll once again remember that the Europeans are important allies, and that allies are a very valuable asset in the world we're going into. So all of this, I think, I think that's key. Now, I want to go back to this idea that Europe is more than the European Union. These particular institutions that emerged as the European Union, they've taken their own direction. Now, the UK has decided they don't want to be part of it. But that doesn't mean that this way of interacting with the other countries is going to go away. And one place to look is that outside of the Europe, there's some cooperation in the European Union in areas of defense and security, but it's quite limited, and it doesn't have the same flavor as the rest of it. It's very much on this basis of unanimity, not qualified majority voting, not supranationalism. My point here is the French, in terms of defense, it's been the French and the British cooperation that's been most intense and important, and I don't see that subsiding. So I mean, there's in the big picture, war, peace, security, that sort of thing, but also in economics, I can't imagine. Okay, for big firms, it could disrupt supply chains. They're going to have to rethink how if the UK decides that they're going to exercise their sovereignty and come up with their own rules, and it turns out that it's not that easy for parts in some long supply chain to go across the English Channel tax-free, so companies will figure that out. So I don't really think it's going to be very disruptive economically for US firms or for travelers. I don't think we'll notice it too much.
The Schengen agreement governs migration, passport-free migration between countries of the EU. It's my understanding from what you say that the UK was never part of the Schengen agreement, and so that really, if we look for change now, immigration is not an issue. And the other thing is the UK was never part of the Eurozone, which means that they're going to be continuing to use the pound. So how does this affect the average UK citizen? Is he going to see any change in the next year or thereafter?
Well, this is you raised some really important points, because during all the negotiations and before that in the campaign, there's been a lot of confusion about immigration in the UK. And there's different levels. As a member of the European Union, any citizen of another European Union country had the right to go to London, go to the UK and work. That's the basis of being part of the EU. So now, at least for the transition period, that will remain largely the same. And it seems like there's also, at least for Europeans who are EU citizens who are currently in the UK, they'll be able to stay there. It looks like they've come up with arrangements for that. But in the future, that might look different. It might be harder. But there's also this question of asylum seekers who are entering the European Union. And so that's a different question. And here, this will mean that the